Father stands in front of the room door, his palms sweating. In his hands is a bouquet of flowers, as modest as he is, as humble as his whole life. The bouquet is not just a gesture, it is a symbol of gratitude. A symbol that he can finally give something back to this man who saved his son. But all he feels now is tension, as if every movement of his body is a step into the unknown. What will he say? How will he say it? It's not as simple as it seems at first glance. He can't escape the thought that this guy who became a donor for his son is not just a hero, but someone who is a complete stranger. And now, standing here with this bouquet, he feels a mixture of gratitude and anxiety. He's ready to give thanks, but what if this encounter is far stranger than he imagines? What if there's something more behind this act of kindness, something he doesn't know about yet? The door is slightly ajar, and through the crack he sees a guy sitting on the bed. All his thoughts suddenly crumble, and his heart constricts at that sight. All he wanted to do was say thank you, but now looking at this man, he feels his body tense up and his mind starts to get confused. Who was he? He saved his son's life. It's a fact, it's an unchangeable reality. But in the back of his mind, despite all his gratitude, the father feels something is wrong. He took a deep breath and slowly backed away from the door, feeling every internal mechanism in his body demanding not to move. Why is it so hard for him to take that one step? Why doesn't he have the courage to just walk in and thank this guy for giving his son a second chance at life? Why is there a feeling of anxiety swirling around in his chest that won't let go? Why does he feel like there's still something important behind this that he doesn't understand yet? And behind him in the hallway, his wife and daughter remain. They realize that he is in for more than an easy meeting, and so they probably decided to leave him alone with this moment. The father took another look at the door. He didn't want to look weak in front of them. He had always been the one who carried all the problems, the one who tried not to show his worries. He was used to solving everything on his own. And now, he was faced with a situation that he had to deal with on his own. But here's what worries him the most. His anxiety is not caused only by the fact that he doesn't know how to behave. No, he lacks confidence because he senses a hidden danger in this encounter. He was not prepared for the fact that he might have to change everything he thought about noble deeds, about altruism. He is ready for a confession, but he doesn't know how to accept the truth. He cautiously turns and walks into the room. Step by step. Each step he takes now feels heavy, as if he is walking on a shaky surface that is about to fail. His fingers clutch the bouquet, and he could almost feel his thoughts begin to jumble and his words become lost. He knew what needed to be said, but now he wasn't sure he should say a word. The guy was sitting on the bed. Outwardly, he looked like a normal person, jeans, t-shirt, short hair. But there was something about him that immediately caught his eye. It was something elusive, like a gaze that pierced, somehow very confident and calmly examined him. His father couldn't figure out what exactly was causing this feeling of unease, but it wouldn't let go. This guy's gaze wasn't just a gaze. It was the look of a man who knew far more than either of them. He stepped closer. The thoughts, the worries running through his mind again. He couldn't help but notice how the kid held himself a little differently than the average person. His gaze was almost calm, but something about his confidence was unsettling. He was just too calm. His father felt his breathing deepen and his heart start to beat faster. "Hello." The father said it uncertainly, but with a desire to get it right. The guy replied with a slight smile, but his eyes remained intense, as if he understood far more than his face was letting him show. This moment was not what he had envisioned. He'd thought he'd walk into the room, say thank you, and that would be it. But now it didn't seem so simple. Was it really as simple as he'd thought? His father coughed, trying to pull himself together. He held out the bouquet. "I want to thank you for what you did for my son. You're a true hero." His voice trembled with tension, but despite that, the words were sincere. But with every word, he felt something inside him clench. These words couldn't just be words. He couldn't say them without thinking. The boy didn't immediately take the bouquet. His gaze didn't change. He didn't move. He continued to sit, as if pondering, on something important. The father felt the inner uneasiness growing again. Something is not right here. This wasn't just a meeting of two people between whom gratitude had been established. This was more than that. And he could feel it. "You don't know what I'm going through," the boy said, and his voice was soft but confident. There was no pride or pity in it. There was something different, almost indifference. Or was it some kind of tension that kept him from accepting the gift? Father froze. Why did his words sound so strange? Why did this guy who had saved his son seem not quite who he's supposed to be? This is when things start to seem incredibly complicated. Gratitude loses its simplicity. In the place of a simple gesture, there is something more, something he is not yet ready to think about. He realizes that this meeting will no longer be what he imagined it would be. And worst of all, he can't believe that all this is happening to him now. When his son went to the hospital, he thought that it was just a temporary hardship, that a few days would pass and everything would be back to normal. But it wasn't days, it was weeks, full of sleepless nights and scraps of conversations with doctors who seemed to make things difficult on purpose so that they wouldn't tell him what was going on. What had started out as a common cold had suddenly turned into a nightmare. He sat in that hospital room with his son, who was lying on a sterile bed, and tried to make himself believe that everything was going to be okay. But every time the doctors left, leaving behind only an empty and heavy silence, he knew it wasn't that simple. There was a growing feeling in his heart that something was wrong, that they weren't just treating a cold, that this diagnosis wasn't one that could be easily cured. The whole hospital was like a maze. Translucent hallways that reeked of chemo and sanitizer. Walls that seemed to absorb the last rays of light like black holes. Those walls, those perpetually ear-whistling doctors. Everything was somehow alien. He wasn't ready for his life to change so drastically. He wasn't ready that it would be his son's turn to wait for surgery, that the days would pass behind studies, tests, checks, and empty reassuring conversations that said nothing in earnest. He felt like he was losing control, that these walls, this sterile air, was no longer just a place where people were treated. It had become a place where his life, his world, had shrunk to the size of this room. His entire existence seemed to fit within these white walls, in this strange world where there was no more time for empty conversations. Every day he woke up with the feeling that they were wasting time. He waited for the doctors to call, waited for decisions. And every night he woke up with the horrible thought that if the right donor didn't show up, his son might not have time to wait for help. The one who seemed like he could save their world, the man with the dark eyes, with the obscure past, whatever he was going to be the one to get their lives back to normal. But then what was going on in this dark-eyed guy's head? Why was this donor so important? And why did everything about him remain in the shadows? The donor. This guy. Who is he? What is he like? And why was he, like an invisible hero, the one who would decide if his son would survive? He didn't know anything about him. Only that he was a young guy from the very donor list the doctors had handed over. He couldn't understand how someone could become so important to his family without knowing a single word about that person. And yet the donor was far from the ideal he would have liked to see. This was not a handsome, good-natured young man who would be engaged with the moral high ground. No. This guy was different. There was something dark in his eyes, something vague, something that made it immediately clear. This guy was not the kind of guy he would want to be around. He wasn't the type that instantly inspires trust. But what made him agree to be a donor for a stranger? What must be the motivation? He couldn't figure it out. Because his father himself was too busy worrying to notice that the guy had his own reasons that weren't so obvious. Reasons that were enough to make him decide to take such a step. And it wasn't just because he wanted to help. It was something more personal, something hidden. Something that drove him to act despite everything. This guy had a dark past that didn't fit the idealized image of a hero. His life was full of mistakes, disappointments, and ridiculous decisions. Maybe even his own realization that he had to change something to bring at least a shred of meaning back into his life led to his decision to become a donor. But that didn't mean his choice was unequivocally a good one. There were no easy decisions in his world. Nothing was unambiguous. This guy was someone who had made a difficult decision, hoping it would go some way toward redeeming himself to the world, to himself. The father didn't know the whole truth. He didn't know that the donor was actually a man who had endured the same hospital corridors, the same lost nights, the same dark moments as himself. This guy was not an ideal, not a savior, just a man who at some point had decided that his life was worth someone else getting a chance at life. His own motives remained hidden. He may have been perfect on the outside, but on the inside, he was far more complex than his father would have imagined. His father might have thought that gratitude would be his primary feeling, but as he met his eyes in the ward, he couldn't help but feel that it was more complicated than that. Gratitude faded into the background, and uncertainty came first. Who was this guy? What had he paid for his rescue? And what did he himself now expect to get out of it? With each passing second, his senses grew more and more tense. He was sinking deeper and deeper into thinking that his son, his favorite boy, was still fighting for life. And it all depended on this stranger sitting before him, silent, attentive, waiting. Will he finally be able to forgive himself for all the moments of doubt he is now experiencing? Will he ask himself the question, why did this particular guy become a hero? Why the hell was he the one who saved his son? As his father looked at him, something inside screamed that meeting this man wasn't just an act of gratitude. It was a meeting of two worlds, of different people, of two destinies that collided in that hospital corridor. As he asked himself questions, he didn't realize that those questions would not give him simple answers. The answers would turn out to be far more confusing than he could have imagined. Father clenched the bouquet in his hands so tightly that his fingers began to ache. He stepped into the room, and at the same moment all his ideas of what this meeting should look like came crashing down. He had expected to see someone completely different. He was ready to meet a heroic man, a kind, slightly shy guy who had saved his son's life. Someone he could thank, feel sorry for, someone he could look up to and see only the bright side. But what he saw made his heart literally freeze. The boy was sitting on the bed, and his eyes were directed straight at his father. Outwardly, nothing special. He was about his age, about 25, with short black hair and a face that didn't stand out in any way. A simple t-shirt, jeans, old sneakers. Everything looked like a normal young man, and that was probably the scariest part. Because when his father saw him, something about him immediately made his heart clench, as if it wasn't just a physical threat hanging in the air, but a whole host of forgotten memories he'd been trying to push out of his head for a long time. This guy looked like someone. But who? His memory wasn't clear. Suddenly a picture popped into his head. A moment, and there it was, in front of his eyes. This guy was completely different from the person he wanted to see. This wasn't just a donor, this wasn't just a random person, but a figure from his past, a past that had long since faded and to which he never wanted to return. It can't be, he thought, freezing in place. His breath caught. He couldn't understand what was happening. Why he felt so uncomfortable, why this familiar face caused such a strange thrill, as if it wasn't a stranger standing before him, but someone with a much deeper connection to him. That look made him feel cold. He didn't know what to do. For a moment he found it hard to breathe. It was as if dark clouds covered his mind. Who was he, this guy? Why can't the father standing in front of him get rid of the feeling that this guy is more than just his son's savior? I mean, he knew him. But where could he have seen him? Why is every corner of his memory resisting this discovery? With each step he took, trying to move forward, the tension grew. The sight in the chamber became somehow unnatural, unreal. It was not what he had expected. He looked at the man who had saved his son and suddenly realized, there was more than just a donor in this room right now. Here was someone with secrets that couldn't be simple. The guy noticed his hesitation and smiled lightly. It was a smile not lacking in confidence, even a hidden challenge. He just sat with his arms crossed over his chest and made no attempt to get up. He didn't move. It was as if he was waiting for something his father couldn't understand. You must be surprised, huh? The boy said, and his voice was indifferent, as if he already knew his father wouldn't be ready for this. It wasn't a concern or a plea for gratitude. It was something else, harsher, not what he'd expected. My father stood as if paralyzed. Two feelings were battling in him, one seeking to express his gratitude, the other screaming for understanding of what was going on here. Why didn't his feelings for this man match his reason? He had saved his son. That was understandable. But somehow it was impossible to simply acknowledge it. It was as if some invisible barrier stood between them, and all his feelings seemed fake, distorted. My father didn't know how to continue. All words seemed empty. He should have thanked. But it was difficult, as if he himself had no words for gratitude. He didn't know what to say to this guy who looked so familiar and yet so foreign at the same time. Somehow, despite the fact that he had saved his son's life, his father couldn't shake the feeling that this man was something scary to him. Somehow, he felt that everything that had happened wasn't entirely fair. And so, he looked at the guy with a dark world peering into his eyes. Not because the guy was bad, but because he was too not what his father expected. All of his senses resisted him just being grateful. Something inside him wouldn't let go, wouldn't let him move forward. Don't worry, the boy said, smiling again, but now it wasn't just the smile of a man who'd saved a life, but something that made him really nervous. His eyes burned with a restrained fire, like he was ready to expose some secret his father didn't even realize he had. Something was wrong, and those eyes were trying to tell him that he had no idea what he had gotten himself into. Father felt a chill creep up his spine. Everything he had thought about thanking this guy instantly evaporated. He began to feel that this whole situation, this whole encounter, was not just an act of kindness. It was something more, something hidden, elusive that he couldn't yet understand. He stood there, trying to pull himself together. He knew that gratitude should be an integral part of this moment, but all he felt was a huge gulf between what he should feel and what he actually felt. He didn't know what to do about that chasm. What to say to this guy. What to do. "You know, I," started his father again, but his words didn't sound the way he wanted them to. He felt like he was losing control of the situation. He was ready to thank, but his words wouldn't come out. The boy looked at him, as if realizing that there was more going on in his mind than just gratitude. There was some warning in his gaze, some hint that there was much more behind that gratitude. Something his father would have to understand. "I know what you're thinking," the boy said, and it was like a lightning strike. "But you don't want to know the truth, do you?" The words pierced the silence of the room. Father could no longer just stand there in silence. The words he heard from the donor seemed to tear the last of the blindfolds from his eyes. He didn't know what to think now. All his noble intentions, all that gratitude he'd been willing to give the kid for saving his son's life, suddenly dissolved like snow in the blazing sun. He didn't know where the truth began and where the lies ended, but he felt that this guy in front of him was more than just a hero. He was something more, and this encounter was not just an act of kindness. It was something far more complex. "What do you mean?" His father's voice sounded like a last gasp in an empty room. He realized that maybe this guy was just joking around, trying to lighten the atmosphere somehow. But there wasn't the slightest spark of jest in his eyes. He knew the guy was telling the truth he wasn't ready to realize yet. "You don't want to know the truth," Donor repeated, his gaze growing even more somber, but it no longer had the certainty in it that it had earlier. "It was something else, stranger." For some reason, Father suddenly felt something heavy clutching at his chest, as if those words were some kind of foreshadowing of what would happen next. Father gritted his teeth, trying to force himself to act. He didn't know how to continue. He didn't know what to do. Only one question began to form in his mind. Why? Why is this guy saying these things? And what was behind those words? He tried to collect his thoughts, but it was as if everything around him was shaky. It was as if the ground beneath his feet began to shake, and the walls in the ward were closing in, shrinking the space, pulling at his soul. This guy who'd saved his son now seemed more than just a man who'd given his blood and his insides for someone else's life. No, he had become a kind of dark figure that hung over the whole event. His father felt his brain slow to a crawl. Why hadn't he noticed this before? Why did everything seem so obvious? Were there hints that these two people, his son and the donor, could be connected in a much deeper way than just medical necessity? He remembered one incident that seemed insignificant but now tugged painfully at his memory. Had they not met before? Or was it just a coincidence that his son had ended up in the hospital at the very moment a donor was needed? Meanwhile, the father, ignoring the donor's words, was sinking deeper and deeper into his thoughts. Details that had seemed unimportant before came to mind. He remembered how someone had told him about the donor's family shortly before his son became ill. He remembered a conversation with a friend who had once mentioned that the guy was from their neighborhood, that this guy was in trouble, that his life was full of strange and dark events. It was all starting to come together. The father could no longer ignore the fact that his son might be the victim of some game he didn't know how to get into. And the guy in front of him had become a participant in that game. He felt the blood drain from his face and his hands grew cold. Perhaps it wasn't just a coincidence. It was far more confusing than that. "I have to find out the truth," a thought flashed through his father's mind. He couldn't afford to remain in the dark with no clear answer. He had to understand what was behind this man, what was behind this rescue of his son. The father walked out of the room, his thoughts literally compressed into a knot. He walked down the corridors of the hospital feeling nothing but muffled anxiety. He wasn't just puzzled, he was absolutely certain. What he had just heard was no accident. It was a message. Signs he couldn't ignore. He felt his steps becoming more determined. He had to find out everything, find out who this guy was, who this donor was, and what the relationship was between him and his son. The father couldn't afford to go into the dark without knowing what lay behind this rescue. How could he trust a man he knew nothing about? He had just saved his son, but how was his life connected to his family? Could it have been a random choice? Or was the donor someone from their past? What if it was someone he wanted to forget about? Who was he? Where did he come from? Dad knew he had to investigate this. He couldn't afford to just accept the situation without asking questions. But the more he pondered, the more he realized that there could be no easy solutions. There was something much darker to this story. And perhaps his son was just part of that darker game. Forgotten memories, scattered moments from the past, began to resurface in his mind again. He recalled conversations that seemed insignificant. He remembered an old friendship, an old connection he had once had with someone who had now withdrawn from his life. How could he have forgotten that? How could he not see that it wasn't all a coincidence? He could no longer go back to his previous perception of events. He knew he had to get to the bottom of it. He had to find out who this man was, what was driving him, and why his son was in this difficult situation. Father stood in the hallway, his heart beating so loud he could hear it echoing in his ears. This moment, this long-awaited moment of gratitude, was not what he had imagined. He was ready to express his gratitude that his son was alive, that all those horrible days with their lives hanging in the balance had finally come to an end. But the more he pondered, the more he felt that behind this gesture of salvation lay something much darker, something that would change his understanding of everything that had happened. Every step he took as he moved back to the ward was now full of doubt. Somehow even the light in the corridor seemed dim, as if he had, unknowingly, come to the very edge of some abyss. He could no longer perceive events as he had before. Everything seemed in question, and at every step his thoughts became more confused. When he entered the ward again, the donor was no longer sitting as before. He was standing by the window, and there was some strange confidence in his posture. He paid no attention to his father, as if he didn't notice how important his presence had become. And yet everything in his demeanor said that he was ready to face whatever was happening. And there was something alarming about that. This wasn't just a meeting of two people, it was a collision of two worlds that could no longer exist apart. The father could not shake the feeling that he was facing something more complex than just an act of rescue. He realized that this story was more than a mere accident, more than a gesture of kindness. Everything around him became confusing, and the questions he hadn't wanted to ask before were now begging to come out. "Is there something you want from me?" he asked, unable to contain himself. There was anxiety in his voice. He tried to hide his fear, but his words gave him away. He couldn't believe what was happening, but he couldn't avoid it. The boy turned and met his gaze. It wasn't just a look, it was a look that penetrated his soul, making him feel vulnerable like never before. There was no pity or regret in it, there was only cold calculation, as if he already knew that all these questions wouldn't lead to answers. "You don't understand," the donor said, "you don't understand what's going on here. It's not just an accident that I became your son's donor. It's more complicated than that. You don't want to know the truth. You don't want to understand why I'm here." The father felt his breathing become heavy. Those words echoed in his head, and it was clear to him that what was happening was no accident. He didn't know what was behind it, but he knew one thing: the price he might have paid to save his son might have been much higher than he thought. He remembered how recently he'd thought he'd just be thankful that it would all be over. But now he could feel his own experiences, his own moral boundaries beginning to crumble. He couldn't just accept all of this without asking himself questions. What if the donor didn't do this for nobility? What if there was something more personal, darker behind it? "Do you think I'm missing something?" Dad asked, clenching his fists. He could feel his nerves straining, his own mental pressure increasing with every second. He didn't know what was going on, but he was sure he was on the verge of something very dangerous. The boy was silent for a while. He was in deep thought, and a whole storm of thoughts seemed to be running through his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was not as confident as before. It didn't have the cold confidence he'd displayed before. There was something vulnerable, something hidden. "It will hurt you to know who I am. It will be hard for you to understand why I'm here. It's not just blood, not just donating. It's part of something much bigger than you can imagine." Dad felt everything around him grow darker. He couldn't believe what was happening. He couldn't imagine that his son was involved in this. None of this could be true. He wasn't prepared for this turn of events. "You can't be who I think you are," my father whispered, almost to himself. "You can't be that person. You can't be that person for my son." But the donor just smiled. It wasn't the smile he expected to see. It was something else, like a man who knew what he could do, and what could be done to someone who didn't understand what was going on. "You don't realize it yet," he said again. "You don't realize that this is just the beginning. You can't just pick up and forget everything that's happened. We both know that your son and we're not strangers to each other. We're more connected than you want to admit." The father felt his consciousness begin to crumble. This wasn't just gratitude. It was something far darker than he could have imagined. With this man, his life, his world, everything he knew, was now connected to something terrible, something deep and dark that could not simply be ignored. His father, clenching his teeth, began to take steps backward. His heart was beating frantically, and with each movement he found it harder and harder to breathe. He couldn't find the words to respond. He didn't know what to do with this truth that kept breaking through all his beliefs. "I can't," he started, but stopped. "I can't accept this. You should just be the hero. You should just be the one who saved my son. This can't be part of some game." But the boy looked at him without moving, and his eyes filled with something deep that made him freeze. "You're playing the game yourself," he said quietly, almost in a whisper. "Only you don't realize it." The words sounded like a sentence. Father froze, realizing that he could no longer get out of this story. He could no longer just give thanks. He was now part of something he couldn't control, and the worst part was, he didn't yet know what price it would cost him. My father stood in front of the donor, overwhelmed by worries and thoughts that had long since gone beyond what he could imagine. He felt every cell in his body fill with unanswered questions. But here, it seemed, he stood on the threshold of revelation, ready to learn the whole truth. He felt that the truth he was seeking was only a few steps away, that he had almost touched it, and now it was being revealed to him. "So what's going on?" he said, his voice no longer as strained as it had been before. He wanted to hear the truth, despite all the consequences that truth might bring. All his fears, his doubts, his insecurities, they were nothing compared to what lay ahead. He was ready. He could no longer stand in the dark, not knowing what was happening. The boy stood still, his face was calm, but there was some kind of fire burning in his eyes that made his father feel that this whole encounter might not just be a shock, it was something deeper. There was a weariness in his gaze, as if he had known long ago that the answer to all these questions would not bring relief. "Do you want to know the truth?" the donor asked, squinting slightly. "Are you sure you're ready? Do you think you're ready to find out what's behind all of this? Do you want to see all the ramifications of what happened?" Father felt his heart clench again. Every word he said sounded not just like a question, but like a warning. It was as if the boy knew that his answer would not bring satisfaction, but would only increase the anxiety that clenched his chest. With every word he spoke, his father felt more and more that he himself was caught in a web from which he would not be able to get out. "I can't live in ignorance any longer," the father said, trying to hide his fears. He realized that he could no longer afford to be blind, that answers, no matter how much they cost, had to be found. But something in him told him that once he got them, he would never be the same again. The boy slowly approached him, and his footsteps, though quiet, sounded like thunder. He knew that every word he said could destroy what his father had left. And he seemed to be enjoying it. "All right, you'll get answers," the donor said, his voice turning cold, almost mechanical. "But remember, you can't turn back time. Everything you learn will change your life. And what you thought you understood will no longer be so. All your gratitude, all your morality. It will all be destroyed." Father gritted his teeth. He felt his body begin to be covered in cold sweat. But he couldn't stop now. He wanted to hear what was behind this man, behind this story, what had brought him to this moment. He couldn't afford to turn away when the truth was so close. "So tell me," he said, trying to squeeze some composure out of himself. "Who are you really? Why did you do this? Why did you become a donor for my son?" The donor was silent for a moment, and then his face became more serious, as if he were about to reveal a secret that was probably hidden from everyone but him. He stood across from his father, and his eyes, like two dark mirrors, reflected the gravity of what he was about to say. "It's more complicated than you think," he began slowly, as if some inner shackles were being pulled from him with each word. "I didn't end up here by accident. I wasn't just some anonymous donor. No. I was a part of your life much earlier than you can imagine." Dad froze. Every word the donor spoke, every action he took, every movement he made, it all called into question everything that had happened. He couldn't understand what had happened, what had brought him here. This encounter was no mere coincidence. Everything that was happening to him and his son was no mere coincidence. You were a part of my life? Dad asked, shaking his head weakly. He could feel his world beginning to crumble. He couldn't imagine that this guy could have been anything more than a donor. It was an impossibility. The donor nodded. Yeah, you know me. I was there for you, but you didn't want to see me. You didn't want to know who I was, what I was. I was someone who was once part of your world. I was part of your shadow. But now that you're searching for answers, you're beginning to realize it's much more complicated than that. Father felt a chill fill his body. He didn't know what to say to that. His words stuck in his throat. What was he supposed to say to this man who appeared to be someone from his past but was hidden from him, who may have been someone he never wanted to remember? You were, his voice trailed off. He didn't know what to say, how to make sense of what was happening. Why was he in front of this man now? What was he hiding? How could this be a part of his life? It was like a nightmare that wouldn't end. Yes, I was the one who was there for you when you were blind. I was part of your past, and now you can't escape the truth. You and your son are connected to it, but you didn't know that. You didn't know who I was. You didn't know what was happening. It was all part of something you didn't want to know about. Father felt his legs begin to shake. He could no longer stand. He realized that the answers he was seeking would not lead him to relief. On the contrary, they would change his life forever. In that moment, he realized that the truth he had been searching for so long was not what he had imagined. What now? Father asked, gulping for air. What am I supposed to do? The donor was silent, and all the father had left was to stand in front of him, realizing that what he had just learned would stay with him forever. He could no longer go back in time, could no longer get back the life he had before this encounter. The truth he sought remained hidden. And perhaps it would always be hidden. The father, horrified at the gravity of the situation, realized one thing: the answers he was seeking never came. He stood in the dark, asking himself questions to which he might never get answers.